Welcome to the deep dive. In a world that often feels like it's spinning faster than ever, with global events constantly shifting beneath our feet, being truly well-informed isn't just a goal, it's a necessity.
It really is.
But let's be honest, navigating the sheer volume of complex information, especially around conflicts that seem to defy any easy resolution, it can feel like trying to drink from a fire hose, right?
Totally. Overwhelming.
How do you cut through that incessant noise? How do you get to the core insights, those genuine aha moments, without getting completely, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data?
Yeah, that's the challenge.
That's precisely our mission today. We're embarking on a deep dive into the very history of war and the incredibly elusive nature of peace. We're putting a specific vital focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and its wider regional implications.
Right, big topic.
Huge. We've pulled from a rich collection of sources, articles, research papers, even some fascinating personal notes, each offering diverse perspectives and some truly challenging, eye-opening insights.
A lot to unpack there.
Our goal, as always, is to extract those crucial nuggets of knowledge, deliver those moments of clarity that make complex issues suddenly click, and provide you with a real shortcut to understanding the deeper currents beneath the daily headlines.
Making sense of it all.
Exactly. We want you to walk away not just informed, but thoroughly informed, with a nuanced grasp, without feeling suffocated by information overload. So let's unpack this, shall we?
Absolutely. What we're witnessing today isn't simply a collection of current events unfolding in a vacuum. It's a dynamic deeply rooted in historical narratives, complex power dynamics, and fundamentally in the very way information is constructed, controlled, and consumed globally.
Right.
Understanding these foundational elements is absolutely key to making sense of what often appears as an intractable, unending conflict.
And speaking of narratives, that's exactly where our deep dive needs to begin.
No.
How these narratives are meticulously fabricated and how that deliberate shaping contributes directly to the roots of conflict and, crucially, to sustained violence.
Yes, it's foundational.
It's not just about what happens on the ground, is it? It's how we, as a global audience, are told about it and what we're conditioned to believe.
Precisely. Let's start with how perception is shaped, often through very deliberate acts of propaganda and control. Our sources highlight a pervasive Western narrative that consistently portrays the West as inherently moral, consistently successful, and fundamentally functional.
Right, the good guys narrative.
Kind of. And this stands in stark contrast to how other regions or peoples are often depicted. Savage, chaotic, dysfunctional, or, driven by irrational hatred. It's a very binary, self-serving construction.
I mean, you see this playing out even in seemingly minor cultural differences, where disproportionate outrage is expressed over something like, I don't know, someone eating with their hands, which is perfectly normal in many cultures.
Yeah, totally normal.
While simultaneously overlooking or minimizing widespread violence, mass displacement, or even genocide happening elsewhere, it's such a stark contrast in emotional response.
It really is.
The sources really emphasize this, going as far as to suggest that Western elites are, in fact, waging a war against humanity itself. Now, that's a very strong claim.
It's a strong claim.
Implying they are actively suppressing natural human empathy and mercy. And this isn't a new stance, apparently. It's just, as our sources argue, becomes starkly visible and undeniable now, especially with global information flow.
Right, it's more out in the open.
What's truly fascinating here, and perhaps hopeful, is the point that the majority of people in Western countries actually oppose certain actions, like genocide, despite what the dominant media narrative might portray. There's a fundamental disconnect.
A huge disconnect between the public and what's being done in their name.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that profound divergence between the elite narrative and the underlying public sentiment.
Yeah.
The sources suggest a significant gap where the public's inherent empathy and desire to stop atrocities, particularly the deliberate targeting of children or mass starvation, that's actively and systematically suppressed.
Suppressed how, though?
Well, this isn't merely about media bias, though that's part of it. It's described as a systemic effort to control not just the information we receive, but our emotional and moral responses to it. It's about creating a kind of psychological distance from the suffering.
Wow. Creating distance. And it goes even deeper than that, venturing into truly chilling territory. One of the sources introduces a quote attributed to a former Mossad official. He allegedly said, and this truly makes you pause, "We create a pretend world. We are a global production company. We write the screenplays. We're the directors. We're the producers. We're the main actors. The world is our stage."
Yeah.
That's That implies a level of global narrative control that's almost difficult to comprehend.
It really does. And this raises an important question. What are the profound implications of such a statement if it holds even a kernel of truth? Our sources argue that if such a reality were indeed widespread, it would foster a deep sense of paranoia within the public
Makes sense.
and could actively push people towards embracing baseless, even conspiratorial theories. This isn't because people are inherently irrational, but precisely because there's a perceived pervasive censorship, a lack of transparency,
Right.
and the overwhelming influence from powerful, often pro-Israel figures who seem to control the flow of information. It suggests a deliberate, highly coordinated manipulation of reality itself, making it hard to discern truth from fiction.
We've seen instances of this narrative manipulation play out in unexpected places, right?
Yeah.
Reaching far beyond traditional political or military spheres. Take the Eurovision Song Contest, for example.
Eurovision, yeah.
The sources discuss reports of an aggressive digital campaign that was allegedly run by the Israeli government's advertising agency. This campaign reportedly involved instructing users to call in all 20 of their allocated votes for the Israeli entry.
20 votes.
Yeah. While technically not against the contest's rules at the time, it definitely raises serious questions about cultural influence, the integrity of such events, and the perceived need for a state to, well, rig events, even in something as seemingly innocuous as a song contest, to achieve a desired outcome or maintain a certain image.
It really speaks to a deep-seated desire for validation, doesn't it? Even if it requires unconventional and perhaps ethically ambiguous means.
Exactly.
It absolutely highlights a desire not just for political or military victories, but for a very specific type of cultural validation and acceptance on the global stage, even if it requires these behind-the-scenes manipulations.
Yeah.
This then leads us directly to another powerful and deeply problematic mechanism of control that our sources extensively detail: the weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations to suppress dissent.
Yes, this comes up a lot.
It does. They argue that this tactic is frequently used to shield Israel from any meaningful scrutiny or legitimate criticism. And paradoxically, by doing so, it actually makes the vital fight against real anti-Semitism much harder. The term loses its genuine meaning and impact.
Because it's used so broadly.
Yeah.
And there are concrete, high-profile examples of this that have resonated globally. Consider the case of football legend Gary Lineker.
Oh, yeah, the BBC thing.
Right, who was reportedly forced to step back from his presenting duties at the BBC, albeit temporarily, merely for supporting Palestinians on social media. Or Miss Rachel, a beloved children's educator known for her gentle approach.
This Rachel, really?
Yeah, she faced a coordinated vitriolic hate campaign online, accused of spreading Hamas propaganda and even being investigated for supposed terrorist ties, all because she dared to humanize Palestinian children in a social media post.
That's unbelievable. For humanizing children.
It is. This is, as one source starkly put it, cancel culture on steroids, a phenomenon that criminalizes legitimate dissent, silences critical voices, and creates a climate of fear.
Indeed. It creates an environment where any criticism, even factual reporting or humanitarian appeals related to Israel, can lead to severe personal and professional penalties. Another harrowing example cited is the deportation of Ramez Ozturk from Germany.
Deportation? For what?
His alleged crime: publishing an op-ed piece calling for divestment from Israel, a perfectly legal and ethical form of protest.
Just an op-ed. Wow.
And this suppression isn't limited to public figures or journalists. It extends directly to academic institutions. Our sources highlight how pro-Palestine speech is reportedly stifled on university campuses across the West, with students and faculty facing disciplinary action or public censure simply for expressing solidarity or advocating for Palestinian rights.
What's truly alarming, and our sources delve deeply into this, is the mention of Project Esther, an initiative by the Heritage Foundation.
Heritage Right, conservative think tank.
Exactly. Project Esther is described as a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. However, the sources contend that its actual purpose is to aggressively target pro-Palestine activists by accusing them of being part of a Hamas support network.
Guilt by association.
And what's particularly insidious, as highlighted by our sources, is that this strategy even includes Jewish peace groups who are critical of Israeli policies, effectively painting them with the same broad brush.
Even Jewish peace groups.
Yeah. It truly makes you wonder, as the source asks, why anyone would believe an organization that systematically works to dismantle the rights of other minority groups or progressive causes truly cares about Jewish safety when it uses these accusations so broadly and, well, cynically.
It fundamentally points to a cynical instrumentalization of genuine concerns about anti-Semitism for very specific political and ideological ends, diluting the term and making it harder to identify and combat actual prejudice.
Definitely.
However, despite these extensive, well-funded efforts to control the narrative, the sources suggest something truly significant. The narrative is shifting.
You think so?
Well, the sources suggest it. We're seeing major media outlets, some that have historically shied away from such direct language, finally naming Israeli war crimes for what they are, and, crucially, platforming Palestinian voices in a way they maybe haven't before.
That's a profound development, isn't it? It suggests that the public anger, which our sources describe as being at a code red moment in multiple countries around the globe, is finally reaching a critical mass, forcing a shift in how information is presented.
Yeah, that pressure seems to be building.
This widespread public frustration and anger is even contributing to significant changes in political landscapes, drawing parallels to the unexpected rise of figures like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, who both, in their own ways, effectively channeled deep-seated public frustration against established norms and political elites.
Right, tapping into that anger.
It implies that even highly controlled narratives eventually crack under sustained public pressure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it implies that the long-standing efficacy of narrative control is, in fact, waning, at least among increasingly significant segments of the population.
Okay.
This brings us directly to the foundational historical roots and ideological underpinnings that not only contribute to, but also actively sustain the conflict's persistence over decades, if not centuries.
Right, let's get into those roots. The Zionist project comes into sharp focus here as a pivotal historical development. Our sources explain Zionism's original aim not as a purely indigenous movement, but rather as a European solution to a distinctly European problem, the centuries-old problem of anti-Semitism that plagued the continent.
A European solution?
Yeah.
Imposed elsewhere.
Exactly. The goal was to establish a Jewish state in the Arab world, specifically in Palestine, but critically, it was to be imposed by force against the existing will and population of Palestinians who already live there. This framing immediately sets the stage for inherent conflict.
This perspective truly reveals the colonial nature of the project from its very inception, highlighting that it wasn't a peaceful resettlement, but an imposition. The alliances that supported this project were crucial.
Who supported it initially?
Initially, it included liberal and social democratic parties across the West. These parties provided vital moral, political, and material support to the nascent state of Israel throughout the mid-20th century. This support was instrumental in its establishment and consolidation, often based on a blend of post-Holocaust sympathy and a perceived alignment of progressive values. Even as the realities on the ground for Palestinians began to diverge sharply from this idealized vision.
It's quite striking how, for example, the British Labour Party, which had initially been somewhat cautious about the Zionist project, became, as our sources put it, Zionist to the bone by the 1950s and 60s.
Zionist to the bone.
They seemingly bought into a very specific propaganda narrative, portraying Israel as a socialist haven or a light unto the nations. In doing so, they seemingly ignored or willfully dismissed the harsh realities of Palestinian life under military rule, and they were quick to dismiss any and all criticism of Israel as mere Arab propaganda.
Yeah, that dismissal is key. It speaks to a powerful ideological capture. What's truly fascinating and deeply troubling, here is the profound moral blindness described by the sources. Leaders like Harold Wilson, a prominent Labour prime minister, went as far as to compare Israel's struggle to the anti-apartheid ANC struggle in South Africa.
That comparison seems difficult now.
Almost unimaginable, right, given the context. And to add a truly stark historical note, a forest was later planted on the ruins of ethnically cleansed Palestinian villages, named in his honor.
Named in his honor. On cleansed villages.
Yes. This vividly illustrates a profound disengagement from the human consequences of their political policies for Palestinians and the way historical revisionism can literally be carved into the landscape.
Wow. Okay, moving to an even more profound and frankly disturbing observation from the sources. There's the idea that Zionism has systematically weaponized trauma.
Weaponized trauma. Explain that.
It has, in their view, taken the immense suffering of Jewish people throughout history, particularly the Holocaust, and turned it into what they call a supremacist weapon. That's an incredibly powerful and provocative statement that demands further exploration.
It absolutely is. This ideology, as explained by the sources, can lead to a truly dehumanizing perspective, where even Palestinian children are viewed not as innocent victims, but as a demographic threat or a future terrorist threat.
A threat, children.
Yeah, this provides a terrifying rationalization for actions deemed necessary to maintain what is termed Jewish dominance. The abuse of Holocaust memory is consistently cited as a key cynical mechanism for profound indoctrination and the manipulation of fear within Israeli society.
How does that work?
It fosters a pervasive belief that any deviation from absolute support for the state or any perceived weakness could inevitably lead to a second Holocaust. It's a constant existential threat used to unify and control.
That sounds incredibly effective at controlling public thought and shaping national identity. Our sources delve into how Auschwitz visits, which should be somber reflections on human atrocity,
You'd think so.
are sometimes directly connected to current conflicts with Palestinians and the military within the Israeli educational system. Furthermore, the Israeli Holocaust Museum, Yad Vashem, reportedly concludes its narrative not with a universal message of remembrance or anti-genocide, but with the creation of the State of Israel.
So the state becomes the conclusion to the Holocaust narrative.
That's what the source suggests, reinforcing this idea that the state is the ultimate guarantor against future atrocity, and by extension, that its actions are always justified for survival.
This creates a meticulously constructed, closed loop of historical interpretation that serves to legitimize current political and military actions, making it extremely difficult for individuals growing up in such an indoctrinated society to question fundamental institutions or state policies.
Right.
Realizing the truth, as one deeply personal source describes, is not a sudden epiphany, but a long, arduous journey. It often requires extensive, in-depth historical research that contradicts the official narrative, and it comes with significant personal cost.
And for those brave few who do embark on that journey of critical self-reflection and historical inquiry, the personal and social costs of dissent in Israel are depicted as truly significant. Our sources highlight painful consequences, including losing family and friends and the immense difficulty of finding a new reference group or community that shares their evolving perspectives. This naturally raises a crucial question. Why does Israel produce comparatively so few dissident thinkers, at least publicly, compared to other Western democracies?
That's a good question. The sources attribute it to a combination of factors. Extremely effective, pervasive indoctrination from childhood. The continuous manipulation of existential fear, constantly reminding people of external threats.
The second Holocaust fear again?
Exactly. And a historical process described as the de-Arabization of Jewish communities.
De-Arabization.
Yeah. This refers specifically to the process where Mizrahi Jews, those whose families originated from Arab lands, were often systematically pressured to shed their rich Arab cultural identity upon arriving in Israel. This was done to facilitate their integration into a dominant Ashkenazi or European Jewish culture and to align them with the state's increasingly anti-Arab policies.
So forcing conformity.
Essentially, yes. This system actively discourages internal critique and fosters conformity by equating dissent with disloyalty or even self-destruction.
That truly sets a grim stage for understanding modern conflict, doesn't it? If the very roots of the conflict are this deeply entangled with meticulously manipulated narratives, the weaponization of trauma, and the suppression of dissent, it explains a tremendous amount about the sustained, seemingly intractable cycle of violence we witness.
Indeed. It leads us directly into the contemporary manifestations of war and the pervasive cycle of impunity that characterizes so much of the current global landscape. The Gaza conflict, for instance, has been described in our sources not just as a war, but as a live-stream genocide.
A live-stream genocide, that's a truly stark and horrifying phrase.
It is, where the systematic slaughter of tens of thousands of Palestinians has, chillingly, become totally normalized for much of the world.
It's absolutely shocking to hear it put that way. But when you consider the sheer disproportionate attention given to Israeli casualties versus Palestinian deaths, for example, our sources highlighted an instance where 2 Israeli staffers killed in a particular event in D.C. received comparable, if not more, media attention than the tens of thousands of Palestinians who had been killed in Gaza by that point.
That contrast is jarring.
It tragically starts to make a horrifying kind of sense. What's also highlighted as a critical turning point is the public relations crisis Israel faces. For many, the mass starvation of Gazans became the absolute tipping point for global concern, rather than the earlier horrific atrocities of bombing campaigns or the sheer number of dead.
So the starvation was the PR breaking point, not the bombs.
Seems that way, according to the sources.
This suggests a deeply cynical strategic calculation. Our sources reveal that Israeli leaders were reportedly willing to admit to a starvation siege as a military tactic, but sought, above all, to avoid images of it reaching the public.
So manage the images, not the reality.
Pretty much. It was the visual evidence of starvation, the visceral sight of emaciated children, rather than the act of bombing or the long-standing blockade itself that triggered a global public relations scramble. This showcases a cold, calculated approach to managing global perception rather than genuinely addressing the profound humanitarian crisis or the underlying moral questions.
And then there's Israel's long-standing, often perplexing policy of employing unthinkable violence to cultivate a specific perception of unpredictability in its foreign relations and security policy.
Unpredictability is a strategy.
Yeah. The comparison to the rap group Cypress Hill's Insane in the Membrane is, I have to admit, both jarring and remarkably memorable in capturing that essence of calculated erraticism.
It's a striking analogy, isn't it? It captures the essence of a strategy designed to deter opposition, not through conventional military might alone, but through sheer, unpredictable, and overwhelming force, often disregarding international norms.
Right.
This is coupled with what our sources describe as Israel's profound contempt for anyone who dares to stand up to it, whether it be international bodies, dissenting voices, or even powerful allies.
Contempt and entitlement.
That's the language used. This contempt is rooted in a deep sense of entitlement, as vividly seen in past actions like Prime Minister Netanyahu directly undermining the U.S. nuclear deal with Iran through a speech to Congress, a move that publicly embarrassed the Obama administration.
I remember that.
This behavior, according to one source, has led to a critical inflection point where Israel, after October 7, has become toast and finished in its current form because it is now blocked from dealing with reality as reality truly is, operating in a persistent state of violent denial.
Violent denial. So unable to adapt or change course.
That's the implication, a state of denial that makes genuine political or social evolution impossible.
That's a powerful and quite damning claim, suggesting a fundamental breakdown in how the state perceives and responds to its own reality and the world around it. And this denial seems to extend into a shadowy world of historical regime change and what our sources describe as chaos tactics.
Chaos tactics, like what?
They detail Israel's historical involvement in regional regime change efforts, citing its deep intervention in Lebanon during the 1970s and 80s as a particularly potent and destructive example.
Indeed. Our sources reveal the IDF's alleged policy under General Raphael Eitan, a chilling directive to kill Palestinians indiscriminately. This wasn't just about targeting combatants. It extended to those who would become terrorists or they gave birth to terrorists.
Kill them all, basically. That's horrific.
It's a horrifying alleged policy. The stated goal was to cause chaos throughout the region without leaving an identifiable Israeli fingerprint. This involved the extensive use of proxies, deliberately playing various groups against each other, Christians, Shia, and Sunnis, often by supplying them with IDF-provided explosives.
So fueling civil wars by proxy.
It was a strategy designed for maximum destabilization and internal fragmentation within neighboring states.
It's a truly horrifying strategy of engineered destabilization. And Ariel Sharon's secret agenda, as detailed by our sources, was even more expansive and audacious in its ambition to remake the Middle East.
Sharon's agenda.
It reportedly included conquering Lebanon entirely, installing a Christian allied government there, then systematically expelling Palestinians to Jordan to establish a state there for them.
Expel them to Jordan.
Yes. The ultimate aim was to eliminate the demand for a Palestinian state in the West Bank, which would then be fully annexed as part of Israel. The sources even mention Sharon's explicit order during the Lebanon invasion to destroy whatever can be destroyed in South Beirut's refugee camps,
Destroy everything.
emphasizing the scorched earth nature of these tactics.
These revelations, drawn from extensive historical research, underscore a long-term, deliberate strategy of demographic and political engineering far beyond simply reactive security policy. It fundamentally challenges the narrative of Israel acting purely defensively. This leads us to consider the profound complicity of power, especially the often overlooked role of technology giants and the mechanisms of empire, in perpetuating this cycle of impunity and conflict.
And this is where Silicon Valley comes into sharp focus. We, in the general public, often perceive tech giants like Google, Facebook, and Palantir as inherently liberal and progressive, almost benign forces for connection and innovation.
Yeah, that's the image, right?
But our sources argue convincingly that this perception was largely a mirage. They contend that these companies, far from being neutral, have actively built powerful tools of mass surveillance, provided direct assistance to repressive regimes globally, and have been demonstrably complicit in violence and even genocide.
Complicit in genocide.
Citing Facebook's documented role in facilitating atrocities in Myanmar as a stark example.
Wow, Myanmar. This exposes a stark contradiction between the public image of tech companies and their actual operational impact driven by profit and data. The shift towards more open and overt support for Israel post-October 7 is attributed by our sources to a confluence of factors, partly due to significant financial interests and investments in Israeli tech, but also partly by buying into Israel's framing of its war as a crucial war for civilization against global terror.
Which resonates with some in tech.
Exactly, which resonates with certain powerful segments in the tech world.
And crucially, the public is becoming increasingly aware of this, which is a major shift in itself. There's a growing understanding of the widespread censorship and the deliberate curtailment of pro-Palestine voices on major tech platforms, leading to a profound erosion of trust.
People are noticing the censorship.
They are. The conclusion drawn by our sources is quite stark. These platforms, due to their core business models and political alignments, are fundamentally not reformable.
Not reformable, so what's the answer?
The long-term solution, they argue, lies not in hoping for internal reform from within these monolithic corporations, but in the challenging but necessary process of building genuine, independent alternatives that are not beholden to these powerful interests.
Building alternatives. That's a huge task. This raises an important question about the very nature of systemic change versus incremental reform. If the core ideology driving these platforms is unfettered growth, data extraction, and mass surveillance, then indeed, fundamental alternatives might be necessary for any genuine ethical transformation.
Makes sense.
This pattern of complicity, unfortunately, extends far beyond Silicon Valley to the broader concept of empire and its various proxies, particularly in the realm of U.S. foreign policy.
Our sources meticulously trace a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy, moving from covert regime change operations to far more open and brazen declarations of intent. This accelerated particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union under the Clinton administration.
The 90s shift.
Right, which reportedly began to systematically defund and weaken the State Department's diplomatic capabilities, while simultaneously increasing military funding, thereby explicitly emphasizing war and coercive force over diplomacy and negotiation as the primary tools of global engagement.
So less diplomacy, more military focus.
That's the argument. This marked a profound shift in the perceived instruments of U.S. foreign policy, prioritizing military intervention and economic leverage over diplomatic engagement and multilateral solutions. It also directly challenges the pervasive U.S. self-portrayal as an unblemished good guy, or a universal beacon of hope around the world.
Yeah, the beacon of hope image versus reality.
Our sources unflinchingly point to its own extensive human rights violations throughout history, from the historical genocide against Native Americans to the systemic violence against unarmed Black people and the often inhumane treatment of immigrants at its borders. This internal reality, they argue, fundamentally undermines any claim to moral authority in international affairs.
Hard to claim moral high ground with that history.
Exactly. So the argument presented is that the U.S. isn't merely a neutral mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at all, but rather, as one source provocatively puts it, Israel's de facto defense attorney.
Defense attorney, not mediator.
Right. This role is evidenced by the billions in unconditional aid it provides annually to Israel, and its consistent use of its veto power to block any and all UN resolutions critical of Israel, thereby perpetuating injustice and enabling continued occupation without consequence.
The veto power is huge. Norman Finkelstein's view, cited extensively in the sources, is particularly insightful here. He argues that Western acceptance and active support for Israel ramped up dramatically after the 1967 war, precisely when Israel transitioned into becoming a highly effective U.S. proxy.
A U.S. proxy after 67.
That's his argument. In this new role, Israel served direct U.S. imperial interests in the Middle East by destabilizing secular Arab nationalism and containing Soviet influence. The deeply troubling argument is that the U.S. has never genuinely wanted Israel to be at peace with its neighbors.
Never wanted peace. Why not?
Seeing it instead as a convenient policy instrument and an offshore research and development hub for the Pentagon. Our sources contend that this very relationship, while seemingly beneficial, is ultimately detrimental to Israel's own long-term stability, welfare, and security, making it perpetually dependent and unable to forge true regional integration.
So the U.S. needs Israel to be a sort of garrison state in the region.
That's the grim implication from these sources. It truly paints a picture of a relationship driven by cynical strategic utility rather than genuine concern for Israel's long-term well-being or the region's stability.
Which brings us to another point of cynicism, the nuclear question, and glaring double standards. Our sources reveal profound hypocrisy here.
Okay, the nuclear double standard.
Israel is widely known to possess nuclear weapons, estimated to be hundreds, yet it maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity and is allowed to do so without any significant international scrutiny or pressure to disarm.
They don't confirm or deny.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Iran faces intense opposition, crippling sanctions, and even threats of military action for merely pursuing uranium enrichment for what it claims are peaceful energy purposes.
The selective outrage is striking, and for many, deeply revealing. Our sources point out how the term Islamic bomb was prominently used to frame Pakistan's nuclear program in the past, instantly associating it with a perceived religious threat.
Right. Islamic bomb you never hear.
Exactly. This stands in stark contrast to the conspicuous absence of terms like Jewish bomb for Israel or Hindu bomb for India, highlighting a clear and deeply biased narrative in how nuclear proliferation is discussed and policed globally.
And the history of U.S. and Israeli efforts to prevent Muslim countries from acquiring nuclear weapons is detailed with alarming specificity. Our sources cite multiple instances: Israel's bombing of a nuclear reactor in Iraq in 1981.
Most Iraq, yeah. Operation Opera.
Right. A similar strike in Syria in 2007 against what was alleged to be a clandestine reactor, and even earlier efforts like the 1960s bombing of an Egyptian nuclear facility. This demonstrates a consistent, aggressive policy of preemptive action.
What's fascinating here is the current intense focus on Pakistan's nuclear program, which is increasingly framed as a direct threat to Israel's existence. This narrative, our sources contend, is actively supported and amplified by powerful Zionist and Hinduko lobbies in Washington.
An interesting alignment there.
Often aligning due to shared geopolitical interests concerning Iran and the broader Middle East. This narrative persists even after Pakistan demonstrated surprisingly strong aerial defense capabilities against India, suggesting a level of military maturity that should temper such anxieties. Furthermore, our sources mention chilling speculation from former U.S. officials that a potential war with Iran would make the Iraq War look like a walk in the park, implying a conflict of far greater scale and catastrophic consequences, partly due to the complex nuclear dimension.
A chilling thought. These points lay bare the systemic, deeply entrenched nature of conflict and impunity, driven not just by local tensions, but by powerful manufactured narratives and interwoven international interests. But what about the path to peace, then? What does that even look like, given these seemingly insurmountable entrenched dynamics?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This brings us to the difficult, indeed often elusive, path to peace and the increasingly fraught debate between the long-standing two-state solution versus the rising one-state alternative.
Okay, two states versus one state.
While the two-state solution remains the global consensus at the United Nations, with the notable and quite isolated exceptions of Israel and the United States, our sources reveal that very few Israelis and Palestinians on the ground actually believe it's still possible or viable.
Why not? What makes it seem impossible now?
Well, the sources detail compelling historical arguments against its moral viability, arguing it only caters to a portion of historical Palestine and the rights of a portion of Palestinians, and perhaps even more critically, its current impracticality.
Impracticality how?
This impracticality is primarily due to the sheer physical reality of 800,000 Israeli settlers now living deep within the West Bank, often in large, permanent settlements that have created an irreversible matrix of control and fragmentation.
Right. The settlements make it physically hard to draw a line.
Exactly, making a contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state almost physically impossible. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests that the historical missed opportunities, particularly after the 1967 war, were absolutely critical and perhaps deliberate.
Deliberate missed opportunities.
Our sources contend that the Israeli government, despite engaging in tactical debates about possible solutions, allegedly never genuinely believed Palestinians had a right to a sovereign state. This underlying rejection, masked by various diplomatic maneuvers over the decades, further cemented the current insurmountable obstacles to a two-state outcome.
This historical and practical impasse leads directly into the intensifying one-state debate and, critically, exposes what our sources refer to as the racial nature of Israel.
The racial nature. Unpack that.
The argument is that Israel's inherent feel of an Arab majority within a single democratic state, A state where all citizens, regardless of ethnicity or religion, would have equal rights, demonstrates its core ethno-nationalist rather than purely democratic foundation.
So fear of losing Jewish majority status reveals its core nature.
That's the argument. This draws clear and powerful parallels to the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa, where similar fears of a black majority government were expressed by the white minority, fearing loss of dominance.
This raises an important fundamental question. Can a state truly be both Jewish and democratic when it is based on the supremacy of one ethnic group over another within its borders?
A contradiction in terms.
Our sources contend this is a fundamental contradiction, arguing that true democracy requires equal rights for all citizens, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. In light of this, a radical alternative is explored: the idea of a greater Syria or a local EU for the Eastern Mediterranean.
Like a regional federation.
Kind of, envisioned as a distant but ultimately more natural future for the region. This would involve people living together in a loose federation, transcending the arbitrary colonial maps drawn in the past and allowing for genuine regional cooperation and shared prosperity rooted in equality rather than imposed separation.
It's a truly radical vision, moving far beyond current national boundaries to a more integrated regional future, one that acknowledges shared history and geography. But for any of this to happen, or for any genuine resolution, there has to be a profound reckoning with impunity and an unwavering pursuit of accountability.
Accountability is crucial.
Yet the widespread expectation, as our sources detail, is that Prime Minister Netanyahu will likely face no accountability for alleged war crimes, possibly securing sanctuary in a third country or having domestic corruption cases conveniently dismissed or delayed. This expectation of impunity is a major obstacle to justice.
It really is. What's fascinating here, though, and potentially very significant, is the critical condition reportedly set by Saudi Arabia for normalizing relations with Israel.
Oh, what's a condition?
It's not just the establishment of a Palestinian state, which has been a long-standing demand, but also, crucially, the prosecution of the guilty.
Prosecution of the guilty? That's new.
It introduces a powerful, explicit demand for accountability from a major regional actor, a new dimension that could change the calculus for Israel and its allies.
And it's not just external pressure or new demands from powerful nations, is it? The sources indicate that some Israelis, recognizing the profound suffering and the strategic dead end of current policies, share views highly critical of their government's actions.
Internal dissent, yeah.
Some Israeli journalists, for instance, are reportedly labeling the recent war in Gaza as pointless, unwinnable, and even horrifyingly a war of extermination. This suggests an internal dissent, a moral awakening within segments of Israeli society, reflecting a growing recognition of the severe moral and strategic costs of perpetuating conflict and occupation.
This internal dissent, however small, is vital. It raises an important question about the effectiveness of existing international bodies and the necessity of genuine external pressure. Previous international mediation mechanisms are heavily critiqued by our sources for being consistently unbalanced.
The U.S. role, for example.
Exactly. With the U.S. role as a so-called mediator described as a bitter joke, given its unequivocal support for Israel. Therefore, there's a strong advocacy for new mediators, moderate Arab countries, Europe, and a genuinely neutral America, who can apply real pressure power alongside robust international enforcement guarantees.
Real pressure, not just talk. And justice, as explicitly defined in our sources, means a concrete set of actions: ending the occupation of Palestinian territories, dismantling all illegal settlements, lifting the suffocating siege on Gaza, and creating real systemic equality for all people living in the land.
That's a comprehensive definition.
Genuine sustained international pressure is seen as absolutely necessary because, as the sources emphatically state, there's currently no cost for occupation.
No cost,
Yeah.
so no incentive to change.
Exactly. It's reiterated that supporting Israel, in its current form, is increasingly not in the financial or political interest of American and European governments, suggesting a pragmatic shift in potential future policy.
This frames the pursuit of peace not merely as a moral imperative, but also as a profound strategic and even economic one for Western nations. It's an argument that continued unconditional support for occupation carries tangible, negative geopolitical and economic consequences.
Right.
This leads us to the critical element that holds, perhaps, the most promise: the power of the people themselves, shifting sentiments and collective action.
People power. How so?
Our sources highlight a significant generational shift in public opinion, especially in the West, where younger people are described as being far less intimidated by allegations of anti-Semitism and are increasingly able to see Israel for what it is rather than through historical narratives.
The younger generation sees things differently.
Seems so. And it's not exclusively the young. Our sources point to powerful instances of older individuals fundamentally changing their minds, such as an 85-year-old Zionist who, after decades of unwavering support, participated in a Women in Black protest, a group known for its peace activism.
An 85-year-old changing their mind. That's hopeful.
It is. There's also the growing exodus from Zionism movement among Jewish individuals. These individuals believe that Judaism itself needs to be liberated from what they describe as the false idol of an ethno-state.
Liberating Judaism from the state.
Yes, arguing that true Jewish safety comes not from militarized borders and supremacy, but from actively fighting all forms of racism and oppression anywhere in the world.
A more universalist view.
This truly highlights a redefinition of Jewish identity and safety that moves powerfully away from an ethno-nationalist framework towards a universalist, humanistic one. The recent election of Zohran Mamdani in New York City is used as a powerful, tangible example of this shifting power dynamic.
Mamdani's election, right.
Mamdani, a non-white, non-old male candidate, achieved a remarkable victory despite being outspent by a staggering 30-to-1 margin by what our sources refer to as Jewish supremacist billionaires.
Outspent 30-to-1 and still won.
Yeah. This demonstrated the profound power of sheer numbers in a class struggle, illustrating the ineffectiveness of what the sources call woke weapons, the accusations of anti-Semitism or other forms of identity-based shaming against a unified, grassroots base focused on economic and social justice.
Here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps the most immediately actionable for our listeners. The concept of market power as leverage.
Market power, how does that work?
Our sources argue compellingly that the public, you, the consumers, the market, are the true paymasters in the 21st century. Your collective activism, your protests, your decisions to boycott products or companies that are complicit or silent on injustices are described as absolutely crucial in shaping future outcomes.
So consumer boycotts actually work.
The sources argue yes. The compelling example of Unilever sales plummeting dramatically in Indonesia due to widespread anti-Israel boycotts serves as undeniable evidence that Zionism, as a political ideology tied to corporate behavior, is indeed becoming a significant liability.
A liability for big business.
It's actively turning the global South, a massive and growing consumer market, against the West. The powerful principle articulated here is no justice, no profit.
No justice, no profit.
Catchy. The argument being that long-term profitability for businesses will ultimately depend on their positive response to a pro-Palestine stance and genuine human rights. The voices in the street, our sources emphasize, echo directly in the boardroom, demonstrating a powerful, evolving form of economic accountability.
Voices in the street, echo in the boardroom. I like that. So it's no longer just about moral arguments. It's about very real, tangible economic consequences.
Exactly. And finally, our sources touch on a deeply profound concept: reclaiming identity and redefining the future for Israel itself. It's provocatively suggested that Israel's true path to becoming a normal society, a society integrated into its region rather than dependent on external powers, involves dislodging itself from its almost total reliance on the U.S. and the West.
Dislodge from the U.S. and integrate into the Middle East.
That's the idea. Instead, it must genuinely integrate into the Middle East, learning invaluable lessons from the history of Palestinian Jews who, for centuries, lived peacefully and productively with Arabs in the region.
This proposes a truly radical shift in geopolitical alignment and a profound reevaluation of national identity for Israel. It's argued that Arabs and Muslims, despite decades of conflict, are genuinely offering a way out of what they perceive as Western exploitation and violence, by articulating a sincere desire for peace and stability rooted in justice and fairness, not dominance.
A different path offered by the region itself.
Potentially. This deep dive also considers the cyclical nature of history and speculates on the end of the post-WWWII secular consensus that has governed much of the world order. It suggests a possible return to sacred thinking and the urgent need for new, meaningful narratives to guide humanity beyond endless conflict.
Wow, big picture thinking.
And the deeply challenging question is also posed: whether the end of Israel, as currently constituted, will involve an internal intifada, a natural and perhaps inevitable consequence of its long-standing policies and systemic failures.
Wow. We've covered a tremendous amount today and truly unpacked so many layers of this incredibly complex issue. We started by exploring how narratives are deliberately fabricated to shape our perceptions. From the West's self-portrayal to the chilling weaponization of trauma and accusations of anti-Semitism to silenced dissent.
The narrative control piece was key.
Definitely. We then dove deep into the modern manifestations of conflict, from the horrific reality of the live-stream genocide in Gaza to the shadowy world of regime change tactics and the deep, often hidden complicity of Silicon Valley and the geopolitical aims of U.S. foreign policy.
Connecting all those dots.
And finally, we explored the difficult, elusive path to peace, looking at the practical and moral impracticality of the two-state solution, the urgent call for accountability, and perhaps most importantly, the growing, undeniable power of collective action and market leverage to truly shift the dynamics.
That power of the people aspect feels crucial.
It really does. So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? If, as our sources so powerfully suggest, the world is our stage, and our consumer choices are essentially ballots in a silent but potent economic election, then what responsibility do you have in choosing the next scene, the next act, and ultimately the next story of peace?
It puts the power back with the individual, in a way.
It does. The younger generation, as we heard, is increasingly less intimidated by old narratives and seems to see things for what they are, unafraid to challenge the status quo. Could their refusal to be silenced, their demand for justice, be the true hope for a future of genuine equality and lasting justice?
Maybe that generational shift is the key.
Consider how your engagement, your choices as a consumer, and your voice can be a vital part of that monumental shift, even if the vision of a truly peaceful future is not yet perfectly clear. It's a powerful, challenging thought to sit with, isn't it?